In 1977, he arrived at Wimbledon a qualifier at just 18 and advanced all the way to the semifinals. As a freshman at Stanford 10 months later, he won the national singles title. But it was the way he won it in an orderly, gentlemanly fashion that was so remarkable. After all, the NCAA doesn't employ linesmen, leaving it up to the players to determine whether a ball is in or out. In years to come, this same player would rage and burn across the face of tennis, changing it, some say scarring it, forever. Here is John McEnroe in full illumination.
Here is a guy who is capable of astonishing beauty on a tennis court and astonishing ugliness at the same time. And that combination is mesmerizing.
Is that too far away from you to see? 4 feet too far to see?
To me, he had the most talent of any player that I've ever watched. And I enjoyed watching him, but I used to turn the volume down sometimes. I used to go, oh no, don't do that, John.
Both you blow the call, but they call me for one. That's perfect.
One of the unfortunate truths about the game of tennis is that sometimes the guy who's the best thing that ever happened to the game is also the worst thing that ever happened to the game.
Come on, show me the mark. I mean, don't waste our time.
I think people are so sort of dazzled by him that they're willing to forgive him every kind of transgression. Sometimes I used to think, when is he gonna grow up? And then it would occur to me that he doesn't really have to.
People didn't like Van Gogh, but he did his art in private, and McEnroe had to do it with 20 or millions really watching on television. So artists get excused.
He was a genius. He was absolutely one of a kind, and I've never seen anybody else that good in his sport anywhere.
We both grew up in the same little town, Douglaston in Queens, New York. And we lived a couple of blocks away from each other. John lived right up the street from the Douglaston Club.
That's how I fell into tennis, just simply the fact that this place was close to my house. I preferred other sports growing up, football, basketball. But tennis was always something that I was best at.
He would follow the seasons, John. I mean, it's not like he played tennis all year round. He didn't have to. At a time when I'd be playing, 6 days a week, John would still play 2 afternoons a week. And he was still better than anyone else who'd come out on the court.
McEnroe's grandparents immigrated to New York City, where his Irish-born grandfather found work as a security guard.
He comes from a family that's very upwardly mobile. And so it was not their tendency to fight the establishment, to fight tradition. On the contrary, it was like, how do we work our way into this? In that sense, McEnroe is like the second or third generation immigrant who's moved up into society rather than fighting it.
We're Americans. I mean, yeah, I'm Irish American, and Irish Americans yell a lot and have a lot of, intensity. So from that viewpoint, yeah, I'm definitely like an Irish American.
In 1972, at 13, McEnroe began attending the Trinity School in Manhattan. The commute from his suburban Douglaston home isolated him for more than 2 hours a day.
The boy obviously learned to study in the subways of New York and study very well.
It was just me by myself, and it was sort of alienating me from the friends that I had where I grew up. But it gave me a sense of the city more that I needed, a little more grittiness to me. It was a sense of confusion about that, but it also seemed sort of exciting.
John told the story on the subway platform, seeing a beggar who has a blind sign and a white cane. One of John's friends challenged him with some obscenity about, "You're not really blind, are you?" And the guy started and opened his eyes and scowled and then went back into his act.
Your skin gets thicker, which in a way is sad because you're sort of cynical of this whole thing. And, if the reality was true, you'd feel really bad for the guy. But it was part of the excitement of it, getting taken for a ride, literally.
John always felt that that was an indication of being surrounded by phonies, and that phoniness was somehow indicative of of maybe a larger world.
John hates the idea of phoniness. He had the Catcher in the Rye in his bedroom as a little kid.
Everybody else is a phony, I'm sincere. Well, that was, oh yeah, he was holding Caulfield right down the line.
It used to bother him that when we played, I would never get mad. And he said, how can you be so phony? I said, I'm not being phony. He said, well, haven't you ever wanted to tell somebody to just F off, you know? And I said, yeah, but, you know, it's always been you. So.
He was just a shy fellow in the back of the classroom who was very witty. He had us laughing quite often because of gentle comments he would make. He had a sense of when he might be close to the line of going a little too far and never stepped over that line.
Thanks for ruining another match for me. You're gonna try to set a Guinness Book of World Record? To screw me? Excuse me.
A lot of what people have viewed as sort of classic McEnroe is classic New Yorker. You walk around the city in such a defensive crouch most of the time. You have to protect yourself physically, you have to protect yourself emotionally.
McEnroe is a New Yorker in his crassness and his rudeness and his savvy, how cagey he is, how smart he is, how street smart.
There's an old saying, you can always tell a New Yorker, but you can't tell him much.
As a teenager, McEnroe served as a ball boy at the U.S. Open. Although the leafy environs of Forest Hills still whispered of a genteel past, the soft summer air was occasionally mixed with a new sound, raucous and quarrelsome.
And look at Nastasi. Bowman says, I'll have none of this. No handshake.
Starting with Nastasi and then on to the Connors and McEnroe eras, they brought a personality and a tempestuousness to it that probably alienated the long-time tennis fan, but definitely popularized the sport.
In some ways, it was very valuable to get across a message that this was a game of you know, simmering and boiling emotion. A game the players cared about passionately rather than something they did a polite stroll through and then shook hands.
He was a true child of the 1970s in the sense that he no longer had the regard for authority that I think people had been raised with in the 1950s. He did not have the conviction that someone in authority was necessarily always right. He was raised in an era to question authority and to say, hey, they may have it wrong.
Nobody was sure who was right in 1979 at Flushing Meadow.
I remember that night well. It was, what was it called? The Wednesday Night Slaughter, I think?
15-11. You play now or it's a game? Right now. You're not making him wait. You're not talking to him. You're supposed to be playing tennis.
For one thing, it was a badly handled match in that it went on, started very late. And by that time, people had been drinking a lot. And Nastasi was the veteran with every wile, every trick, and he was stalling, and he had done everything to throw McEnroe off and couldn't faze him.
Game McEnroe.
Frank Hammond, the umpire, was pleading, Elia, please play.
I think he kind of knew that he didn't really have much of a chance in a match unless he could really turn it into a total bizarre nightmare that nobody knew what was going on. Maybe he could steal a match that way.
Game, set, match, McEnroe.
The place went crazy. They weren't ready for the match to be over. It was a show, and the show must go on.
The show did go on when the tournament director replaced the umpire. McEnroe won in 4 sets. Then, in the final, the feisty 20-year-old from 10 minutes down the street won his first Grand Slam singles title.
With that generation, the game became wholly dependent on personalities. It's not your father's tennis game. But I'll tell you what, TV programmers loved it because the ratings shot up.
There's an extraordinary magic about Wimbledon. Once you walk through those gates at Church Road, there's a feeling that this is a very special home of sport.
She was a no-show. Well, speaking of...
TV programmers loved it because the ratings shot up.
There's an extraordinary magic about Wimbledon. Once you walk through those gates at Church Road, there's a feeling that this is a very special home of sport.
It was the original tennis tournament in 1877. So when you go into that center court, you realize that there are hundreds and hundreds of ghosts who have played on that court and who have been champions.
It is the last of the great championships still played on grass. The actual smell of mown grass brings a wonderful feeling of relaxation and pleasure. And then, of course, there's the royal connection. The fact that the players bow on the way out onto the court and then afterwards again when the match is over.
And the British are so good about pageantry. You are intimidated, I'm sure most players are, and McEnroe wasn't. McEnroe wasn't intimidated.
The call came before the ball was played.
He never even called it.
Well, no, yes, he called it.
No, he never said anything.
When you get someone like a John McEnroe, which brings out what Britain would say would be the ugly side of America, they played it up to the hilt.
Could I have the referee, please?
No, not.
Could I have the referee?
No. Play on.
I'd like to have the referee.
When he burst on the scene, it was in the late 70s, were Sex Pistols, punk rock. It was the exact same time when kids are walking around with sticking safety pins in their cheeks. Well, he's Johnny Rotten, and he's Johnny Rotten going to Wimbledon.
That is a point of law. I want the referee out here right now. I aced it.
Here's McEnroe, who even to Americans is jarring, and you ship him as a gift to the Brits as a reminder of what happened in 1776.
The blood scent of revolution tinged the mannered sanctity of Wimbledon when McEnroe faced Bjorn Borg in the 1980 finals.
It was a terribly wet Wimbledon, and so it was sort of almost a surprise. This absolutely brilliant flower just opened before your eyes.
There was Super Brat this, Super Brat that on the radio, on the front pages of all the newspapers, and it was a big deal. And here he's playing Borg, who had won 4 Wimbledons in a row.
Bjorn Borg was quite literally this golden presence on the court and seemed to exude goodness.
Everybody knew that if there was anyone who might beat him, it was going to be John McEnroe.
It was a wonderful contrast to start with. Borg is the champion, McEnroe is the guy on the make.
Sweden versus New York, left-hander versus right-hander, baseliner versus a guy who had that great serve and that great touch at the net. And now they play the tiebreaker.
With Borg leading 2-1, the tiebreaker of the 4th set became an epic.
It's like a poker game. He kept raising the stakes. I'll see you. I'll see you. Okay, no, I'll raise you.
Leading 8-7, McEnroe looked to serve out the set.
You knew this was one to go in the record books, not just as sort of facts and figures, but this was one of those emotional days when you were as worked up as they were.
Center court that day started rooting for John to win the tiebreaker just because they couldn't imagine that they wanted this Saturday afternoon to end. They just wanted it to go on and on and on.
Borg serving, tied at 15.
Unbelievable shot.
I felt that I had more pressure than he had. This is my match. I cannot slip away my match. But it might.
After 22 minutes and 34 points, McEnroe had fought off 5 match points to survive.
When I lost the tiebreaker, I thought I lost the match. I'm supposed to have won this set, to have won this match. And here I'm still sitting, changing side, and we're going to go out and play a 5th set.
People forget that the last set, after this extraordinary, excruciating tiebreaker, was perfect tennis. I mean, it was just perfect. I mean, it should have broken Borg's heart. And he just came out and he just played like a machine.
Trailing 7-6 in the 5th set, McEnroe had run out of heroics.
After the match, it was just like a relief. I was too scared to think what I would do if I lost that match.
Well, it meant to me that you can come in first even if you lose. Yeah, I would have preferred to win and should have won, but, you know, my stature was higher.
He won so many friends that he may have lost in previous occasions, and people had nothing but respect and praise for him.
I could even see on his eyes, I'm going to be back. This is not the last time we're going to play.
I remember the aftermath of that match so well because we were both heading back to New York on the same plane. John and his father were up in first class, and I went to visit them, you know, once we had taken off. Mr. McEnroe saw me, and he had all these stacks of newspapers. He just looked up at me. He was reading all this poetry about his son, and he turned to look at me, and he was crying.
McEnroe made a new name for himself at Wimbledon that day, which he immediately the following year lost it all.
You cannot be serious! That ball was on the line. Chalk flew up. It was clearly in. How many are you gonna miss? He's walking over. Everyone knows it's in this whole stadium.
There was a lot of people that hated McEnroe, hated what he stood for. He was a despicable human being by a lot of members. His name was vile.
I found it painful at times. It was boorish and painful, and I was embarrassed for him. I'm just not comfortable watching this kind of childish behavior.
You know, I don't know what to tell you. I don't have any doubt they're offended by it, but, you know, what am I supposed to do? Go by what rules that they're going by, or should I go by what I believe?
Why are you absolutely completely ruining the match?
I see fooling. I'm sorry. You have to play that.
Clearly, what the point of you overruled? Why? It's 30 seconds, right? I have 30 seconds to complain more, right?
Yeah, I guess I have a bad temper. I guess I have a bad temper when people are not doing their best on what I do professionally.
The officiating in those days was amateurish, to put it mildly. I mean, they didn't know what was going on.
I said he was the prince of the world. That's exactly what he is. What did I say, umpire? Tell me. Please tell me. Please tell me.
They didn't know how to deal with him. They were so afraid of taking that sort of stance and saying, you know what, you're out.
He was totally out of control the entire time. He was going to do everything he could to win a tennis match, and he didn't care what he said or what he did. By all odds, he probably should have been thrown out of the tournament 3 different days.
McEnroe ended Borg's reign, beating the 5-time champion in 4 sets. Then he stoked the membership's wrath by not attending the traditional winner's dinner.
You know, to me, I wanted to spend it with my family and friends and the people that supported me. Well, not a bunch of stiffs that are 70, 80 years old telling you that you're acting like a jerk. So then all of a sudden, you know, I was the first guy who wasn't given a membership to Wimbledon, or winner in, 100 years. Big deal, you know. When's the next time I'm going to Wimbledon? The next time I defend my title? You know, I ain't exactly going to be going over there to practice.
People say that had John McEnroe been disciplined more often earlier in his career, it would have made a difference to him. I don't think so. I think it's just in John.
There are very few athletes who can raise their game out of anger, but McEnroe was one of them. He realized that early on, and so wasn't afraid to use it.
Oh, he would sometimes argue the business about the perfectionism and I just want to win so hard and all that kind of thing. But I think in his heart of hearts, he knew when he acted like the fool, how could he expect people to love him? John McEnroe had to be loved for his genius. He didn't give you an opportunity to love him for anything else.
Answer my question! The question, jerk!
For so long, people thought, well, just because he challenges a linesman and screams at a Wimbledon official in a blazer, somehow this guy is the ultimate rebel with no regard for the true roots of the game. Well, that was simply not true. And all you had to do was look at his Davis Cup history to understand that. Davis Cup obviously just spoke to his soul.
Everything about McEnroe is cross currents. The guy who's completely un-tennis was very much involved in the tradition of tennis. He understood what mattered.
In the United States, he resurrected the Davis Cup. It was dead when he came onto the scene. I mean, Connors had snubbed it. He hated Davis Cup, and there were no other big names, really, that captured the public's fancy.
They've turned down the honour of playing for the United States. They've turned down the Davis Cup, not McEnroe. He's proud of that thing, and that I love. Loyalty, first of all to the family, second to the country.
And the first time they asked him, he said yes, when everybody else was saying, at best, maybe. And he was saying, count me in. And that was, as we know, because of Harry Hopman, his mentor's premium on Davis Cup.
Harry Hopman was this gentleman from Australia who captained the Davis Cup for like 25 years and won about 15. He was one of the people around the sport of tennis that when he walked down the court, he inspired you, and he was a beautiful man. He looked at me and he said to my parents, you know, there's something about this kid.
Harry said, come with me a minute. He said, there's a lad here I want you to have a look at. And we walked all down this row of courts. And then on the furthermost court, there were these 4 lads just scuffing about in the clay. And Harry said, see that one in the corner, the little one? He said, he's going to be world champion one day. And I said, Harry, come off. He said, you wait and see. I said, what's his name? He said, John McEnroe.
As a member of 5 Davis Cup champion teams, McEnroe would often single-handedly carry his U.S. squad to victory. His first starring role was cast against the British in 1978.
He just made me look like a complete idiot out on the court. I mean, he was brilliant. He just sort of, you know, cut me to pieces. And there was nothing I could do. And it was like, I felt like I needed a handicap of some sort.
Rod Laver, whom many considered to be the greatest ever, and whom John had idolized, after that was over, said, it's an honor to be compared to him.
I remember the late Arthur Ashe describing playing McEnroe. He said, you know, it's a nick here and a cut there, and before you know it, you've bled to death. I mean, he really was Mac the Knife.
In 1982, McEnroe showed a level of resolve that was overlooked by the old guard. Instead of misbehavior, endurance and guts were the keynotes of his victory over Sweden's Mats Wilander in a quarterfinal that lasted more than 6 hours.
John is going to run it down.
Oh, it's beautiful to watch. It really is.
Tennis is a very selfish game by nature, and so here's an opportunity. If you get together as a team and you try to accomplish something for someone besides yourself.
McEnroe does it again. After 6 hours and 45 minutes, looks as though he is in tears. That's a fault. McEnroe's on his way to the chair.
First the lady called football on me, now she's calling out.
McEnroe's fierce patriotism was often lost in the blaze of his ugly behavior at the Davis Cup. His antics often putting him at odds with U.S. captain Arthur Ashe.
He liked John McEnroe. He wanted to like John McEnroe. He knew how bright McEnroe was. And yet, McEnroe's temperament not only was distasteful to Ashe, but also confounded him, like everybody else. Why does he do it? I don't understand it. I mean, that's what went through Arthur's mind. And then McEnroe is screaming, why doesn't he help me?
John felt that Arthur should be there for him more, you know, during a match. John wanted Arthur to stand up for him if he got hooked on a call, and it wasn't like Arthur to get up and start wagging his finger at the chair.
Our relationship when he was captain and I was playing was great off the court and difficult on the court. He simply disagreed with, you know, the way I was acting.
Arthur's coming out to keep McEnroe quiet.
And Ashe is mad with John McEnroe now. He pointed at him as if to say, go back there, kid, and go play.
There was no discussion about my play. It was just about how I behaved. So that's the only time he ever said anything to me.
Arthur internalized everything. He wanted always to be so in charge of his emotions. In his book, Arthur said, in some ways, I wish I'd been more like John.
For all their disagreements, Ashe appreciated that McEnroe put his principle ahead of his bank account by refusing to play in South Africa in 1980.
I guess the fact, number one, that, you know, someone was offering me $1 million for one day, that told me something was wrong. That I was trying to bring the game to the masses, to give people the opportunity to play. So it didn't make sense for me to, like, go down there and take some money from some rich white people that were trying to, you know, suppress the system.
McEnroe's view of Ashe would mature with the passage of years and the onset of a larger concern than tennis,
And then suddenly this, I thought, wow, this is incredible that, he got AIDS and stuff. And it started making me realize, man, I really was coming from like too competitive a place. Only in his passing did I realize that the way he was trying to be was very difficult. Being black in a white world, and particularly tennis. Arthur was the greatest ambassador we ever had, and that, he'd been through 100 things times more difficult than I had gone through. And, I'd have my feelings about the way he should have acted, and I realized it was just asinine for me to even really, pretend like I knew about it.
And I remember at Arthur's death, he made a very honest and telling statement. He said, Arthur's standards were too high for me.
The 1981 U.S. Open, the fourth McEnroe-Borg Grand Slam final in 2 years, would also be their last.
It was a fascinating rivalry because John never misbehaved against Borg. He felt that he couldn't waste 1 ounce of strength screwing around.
He seemed to check out of the match. I wasn't sure if that was me. I thought maybe, I got to him a little bit.
I got the sense that he said, you know what, I don't have any answers for this guy. And it was like a fighter saying, I just can't go back into the gym and learn some new tricks.
Borg was soon out of the game, never having won a U.S. Open.
All of a sudden, McEnroe lost the standard against which he was measuring himself and trying to elevate himself.
That we were part of like a magical part of history, and that I'm thankful for. And I think that the more time goes away, actually, the more people appreciate it.
In '84, I'm not so sure that there was ever any player, Laver, Tilden, or anybody else, who was as good as McEnroe that particular year.
He was just absolutely brilliant. That was him at the height of his powers.
1984, McEnroe's grand opus, which ended with an 82-3 record. But one of the defeats was at the French Open.
He was overtaken by hubris that day. He had won the first 2 sets from Ivan Lendl, and he thought he could waltz in.
There may have been a tinge of arrogance there, too, to feel that, well, I'm beating Lendl with my game, and now I'm going to beat him at his game, too.
And John had that match on his racket. He was about 4 minutes away from winning the French Open.
John McEnroe had his biggest vulnerability revealed, which was his lack of fitness. Ivan Lendl was working harder at the game than John McEnroe.
Ivan Lendl has finally won a Grand Slam championship.
It was by far the most devastating loss that I ever experienced, because it was, obviously one I should have won. There was no question about it.
With that title, historically would have put him on another level, no question about it. Because now here's a guy who would have won on 3 surfaces. If he had won that match, he could have walked away from the game saying, I did pretty much everything I wanted to do in this game.
Chastened by the loss to Lendl, McEnroe arrived at Wimbledon 2 weeks later with his game honed to a lethal edge.
The '84 final was very special for the extraordinary speed at which John was seeing the ball. He seemed to be able to see it so early, and he was making angles which were, frankly, just impossible. Some years later, I asked him to reflect on that match and said, I'll tell you something. When I got out of bed that morning, he said, I felt in a very different mood than I've ever felt before. And when I got out on the court, time seemed to slow down, and I seemed to have all the time in the world to play my shots, and that's just what it looked like.
He just took Jimmy right out of the match and stepped on his neck and never let him up, and never even let him be part of the conversation.
Rarely had their duels been so one-sided.
I think John and Jimmy Connors both felt sort of the same way. Like, let's stop pretending that this is like croquet. This ain't croquet, this is war.
They made you care about the event. It seemed that they wanted to win so badly, whether it was Connors pumping up the crowd or McEnroe complaining about a call, that it was fascinating.
All they want to see is two guys out there scratching and clawing and beating the hell out of each other. And if a little blood comes out, that's even better.
Privately, they would tell you that the other guy was a bad guy and they don't like him and they want to kick their ass.
Keep your mouth shut out here.
He thought Jimmy was a phony. He didn't like how Jimmy would play to the crowd.
And Jimmy had this, great sort of snow job that he was from New York and that somehow they thought he was more New York than I was.
Connors would not lose his temper the way McEnroe would. That was the difference between the two. You take away the emotional outburst of McEnroe, and it's an artist. It's something beautiful moving around, and you can't even tell what he's doing. And so the New Yorkers tended not to understand the beauty and to understand the ugliness all too well.
The rivalry peaked at the U.S. Open, where they battled in a 5-set semifinal thriller. McEnroe prevailed over Connors, then avenged his French Open loss to Lendl by winning his 7th and final Grand Slam singles title. 2 years later, he took a 6.5-month sabbatical from the tour.
He dropped off a cliff. I mean, it was over. He took a break from the game. He lost basically all conviction. His game was never the same.
He pulled a hamstring in the fall of '84, and I just don't think rehabbed it properly. His game was so built around quickness, and I think when he lost that half a step, people didn't quite understand how big an impact that had on his game.
During that sabbatical in 1986, McEnroe married actress Tatum O'Neal. His new life did not accommodate the demands of professional tennis.
It took a back seat in a sense. I had a couple kids and your priorities shift. It just did not seem as quite as important as it was.
His whole life really changed a lot. He was falling in love with Tatum O'Neal, and he was playing less doubles. And the doubles is what really, I think, kept his game sharp. And he just wanted to spend more time with his social life. Hit the discos and hit the cool parties.
He was pretty famous for liking his nightlife. I've seen guys who worked harder and were more disciplined, and that's a fact.
It got the best of me. Some of it I brought on myself, I suppose. So you gotta just, I ultimately have to take the blame myself.
I certainly didn't think he was going to win his last major at 25. I think John really liked the climb to the #1 spot. Once he got to #1, I think the dynamic changed an awful lot.
Are you tired of overnighters that don't
return? McEnroe tries to fight his way back to the top, but finds that his toughest rival is himself.
Prepare to be blown away.
He always has people coming up to him. We were in Atlanta airport, and a little 8 or 9-year-old boy walked up to him and said, "Mr. McEnroe, could I have your autograph, please?" And he looked down and he said, "F off."
McEnroe leading. Look out.
The royal box is right behind him. So the Prime Minister and the King are there. They were all just so...
Look out, look out.
Your skin crawled. You kept saying, "Oh, don't do that. Oh, please don't do that. You're such a jackass."
How come you waited 2 seconds? It takes a little while to Australian ears to pick it up.
Sometimes it bothered me what John was doing. Sometimes I thought, that's such a waste. He's creating this magnificent art and then he's spray painting it with graffiti.
You're pathetic, you know that? You are the worst umpire that I've ever seen in my life. You're never going to work another match 5 innings.
The central dilemma, I think, of anyone who was ever close to John McEnroe was, how do you keep explaining to the rest of the world that he's a much better guy than he seems to be?
Couldn't you see one damn call? Couldn't you see anything?
John McEnroe is basically a very self-centered person. He's like some politicians and some artists who really think that the world sort of revolves around them.
You can't see a damn thing if you couldn't see any of those balls. Those balls were in. That was set point. Do you realize that I've lost a set because of that?
Because he feels things so strongly, he would rarely think before he'd act. I think when he was done with the matches and in the locker room, I was there a number of times with him when he'd say, "What did I do?"
That ball was out! The set was over!
The tone of your language or conversation can get where some words come out, and it's difficult to sort of turn that on and off. I was successful at it for many years when I first started playing. And I think one of my biggest disappointment was I couldn't keep that separate. Sometimes liking the way it sounds when you just sort of get into a heated conversation. And then suddenly you find yourself saying it, and then you go, God, that sounded really bad, you know, on the TV or whatever.
This no goes with my family. They understand that I curse every now and then.
I can't give you, like, the reason, you know. I mean, I came from an upbringing where, you know, my parents, they yelled a lot at each other. But, you know, so, you know, it was a normal thing. Living in New York, a lot of people yell. You know, this is normal to me.
When he got disqualified from the Australian Open, got thrown out of the tournament, I was very critical of him. But my sense of it always was, you know, you can't defend the indefensible.
Oh, that won't work. Advantage point. You're going to need another one for sure. Point penalty, Mr. McEnroe.
If a player broke a racket, it's a code violation. And McEnroe didn't want it. He said, I still play with this racket. I can still play with it. So they called me out in the court, and John went through his pitch of why I shouldn't give him a code violation. And I said, I can see the crack in it. And I said, the point penalty stands. And just as I was walking off the court, he let me have a good verbal blast about having a relationship with my mother, let's say, in no uncertain terms.
Code violation, verbal abuse, default, Mr. McEnroe. This match is over.
It was actually a very easy call because it was so gross, so blatant, so offensive that there was no question it had to be defaulted.
I mean, this is like a long story, you know, that culminates in me getting defaulted at a big tournament. I mean, I guess it was bound to happen. It's too bad. I don't feel good about it.
I think the last thing he wanted to do was tarnish or embarrass the game. And in a way, he did.
Of the 10 Grand Slam events he played between 1990 and 1992, only twice did McEnroe even make the semifinals. His game was no longer dominant in a new era of power tennis.
I actually had the arrogance to believe I could go through him. I knew he was going to make serves. I knew he was going to make volleys. I just wanted, when he got his racket on the ball, to feel a pace that he hadn't really felt before.
That Agassi loss really told him more than anything, I'm done. He had no answer for Agassi whatsoever.
After a difficult divorce from Tatum in 1992, McEnroe looked for support from his Davis Cup teammates.
To me, it sort of epitomized Davis Cup because I was struggling and I really wasn't. I was having trouble sort of practicing and getting into it. Being part of this great team with Pete, Andre, and Jim was probably the most emotional win of any of them.
McEnroe, as he has done so often in the past, picks up that flag.
I was lucky. I was lucky to watch him play some incredible Davis Cup matches that I think ultimately inspired me to feel the way I do about it today.
Like a lot of people, we have some credit card.
In 1999, John McEnroe, at 40, was made captain of the U.S. Davis Cup team.
They had to get McEnroe. I mean, this whole situation was a crisis. Top players weren't playing, ratings were plummeting. It was very close to becoming an irrelevancy.
When I first heard that he was going to be appointed, my first thought was, wow, you know, if Mac loses it, I mean, you could have literally an international incident.
In times of crisis, everybody always looks for a man on horseback. Well, this man on horseback is like the legend of Sleepy Hollow. You look at him the wrong way, cross him, and he's liable to rip his own head off and throw it at you.
And there's no greater emotional leader and motivator than John McEnroe. And I have no problem with seeing John McEnroe say to Pete Sampras, "You're the greatest player who ever lived. Stand up and start acting like it."
I've never known a captain to sit on a bench and sell tickets, but he does.
John, seriously, what kind of discussion?
Seriously? I was serious. You cannot be serious.
We love guys who cannot take themselves so seriously. And to come from the guy who took himself so seriously that it was painful to watch, that has been refreshing.
The very people in the media that criticized John McEnroe and his behavior are the same people in the media that are saying, where are the characters? Where's John McEnroe? Sampras doesn't show enough character. Well, what do we want here anyway?
A centre court was more than a court, it was a stage, a drama. And he could be the hero and the villain, all in the same play. You could love him 1 second, then the next second the crowd would be booing him. And next second they were in love with him. He held the world in his hands, in his left hand.
McEnroe at the net, this unprepossessing figure standing at the net and taking bullets from these incredible athletes. He would take the pace off the ball, and you'd feel like the moment lasted forever.
You wonder, without the temperament, without the fiery mood, would he have been as great a champion? Would he have been as great a player? As far as I'm concerned, I'm just thrilled to have lived through a period when we had the whole package, even if there were a few bits of it that you could have done without.
People always want to sort of put it at a level where, like, it sounds like you failed. Once again, it goes back to what I believe is important, which is don't look back. You know, why bother looking back? Only, you know, what is that going to do? It's going to make us feel like that we didn't do something right, like big deal. You know, there'll be 10 more things today I don't do right.
His self-absorption, monumental temper, and sheer love of the spotlight could be reason enough to characterize him as the antithesis of a team player. How could McEnroe complement another's game? How could he sacrifice himself for the good of the whole? Well, the emphatic answer is not just in his Davis Cup participation, but in his brilliant doubles record, 78 men's and mixed titles, including 10 Grand Slams. For ESPN Classic Sports Century, I'm Chris Fowler.